my colleague Dr. Abhishek Bansal. A special welcome to Professor Betty Govindan from University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, and a very good morning to all the participants who have joined us this excellent morning for this second lecture. To begin with, I'd first like to give a brief introduction of our speaker, Professor Ajay Sakaria. Professor Ajay Sakaria is professor at the Department of History, Institute of Global Studies, University of Minnesota, USA. He studied political science and history at MS University, Baroda, and did his doctorate from Trinity College, Cambridge. He also worked as journalist for Indian Express. He was a member of Subaltern Studies Editorial Collective from 1995 till its dissolution. He is one of the co-editors of Subaltern Studies, Volume 12, and the author of Hybrid Histories, Forests, Frontiers, and Wildness in Western India, and Unconditional Equality, Gandhi's Religion of Resistance. Currently, he is working on another book, What is Democratic Secularism? Professor Sakaria has very kindly agreed to deliver his talk on the topic Gandhi and question of friendship. We welcome you, sir. Before going ahead with this presentation, first of all, I'd welcome and request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, for his introductory remark.
I'm not able to hear anything.
सर आपकी आवाज नहीं आ रही है. सुप्रियो या गौतम जी जो भी हैं, प्लीज चेक.
1 minute, sir. I am checking, sir. Just a minute, sir.
Vikram?
Yes, sir.
Ask Gautam ji or inquire from anybody whether VC sir is able to hear us or not, because we can see him and.
Gautam ji, can you hear us?
विक्रम सर सुनाई दे रहा है आपको?
हाँ, अभी सुनाई दे रहा है सुप्रियो, सुनाई दे रहा है.
ठीक है.
धन्यवाद डॉक्टर विक्रम. इंटरनेशनल रिलेशन डिवीजन एंड डीन स्टूडेंट वेलफेयर, इंदिरा गांधी नेशनल ट्राइबल यूनिवर्सिटी द्वारा गांधी एंड वी फाइंडिंग द कनेक्ट विषय पर आयोजित व्याख्यान श्रृंखला की दूसरी कड़ी में हम सभी से इस डिजिटल प्लेटफॉर्म पर संबद्ध हो रहे हैं. प्रोफेसर अजय सकारिया जी और प्रोफेसर निको स्लेट जी, डीन स्टूडेंट वेलफेयर प्रोफेसर भूमनाथ जी, प्रोफेसर नवीन शर्मा जी, डॉक्टर अभिषेक बंसल जी, और वे जो इस कार्यक्रम से संबद्ध हैं, इसे सुन रहे हैं, हमारा टेक्निकल स्टाफ और विशेष रूप से गांधी के विषय में रुचि रखने वाले लोग. वस्तुतः गांधी न केवल भारतीयों के प्रेरणा स्रोत हैं, अपितु मानवता के लिए संकल्पित दुनिया में जहां कहीं भी लोग हैं, सामान्य हो, असाधारण हो अथवा राष्ट्र नायक, सभी को प्रेरित करने वाले गांधी और उनसे प्रेरित करने वाले लोग. मुझे बहुत प्रसन्नता है कि हमारा विश्वविद्यालय इस संदर्भ में व्याख्यान की श्रृंखला आयोजित कर रहा है और आज प्रोफेसर अजय स्कारिया जैसे और प्रोफेसर निको ले जैसे हमारे विश्वविद्यालय के साथ इस कड़ी में जुड़े हुए हैं। वस्तुतः गांधी महामानव के पर्याय कहे जाते हैं और ऐसा इसलिए है कि जो सत्य और अहिंसा को लेकर के आजीवन यात्रा करते रहे। सत्य को नियम माना उन्होंने और अहिंसा को कर्तव्य माना। गांधी इंडियन ट्रेडिशन के प्रचारक भी हैं, विस्तारक भी हैं और भाष्यकार भी हैं। हमारी परंपरा में ही सत्य और अहिंसा को लेकर बहुत सारी बातें कही गई हैं। अहिंसा को लेकर कहा गया अहिंसा परमो धर्म श्रुत्युक्त स्मार्तयोच, अहिंसा श्रेष्ठतम धर्म है, ऐसा श्रुतियों और स्मृतियों में कहा गया है। धर्म न दूसर सत्य समाना, आगम निगम पुराण बखाना। हमारे यहाँ मानस में भी है कि सत्य के समान दूसरा कोई धर्म नहीं है। इसलिए सत्य और अहिंसा दोनों की युक्ति गांधी के व्यक्तित्व की रचना में सर्वाधिक सहायक, महत्वपूर्ण और नियामक रही है और इसी को लेकर के गांधी जी आजीवन चलते रहे और इसी भाव से सत्यम शिवम सुंदरम का संदर्भ लेते हुए गांधी ने न केवल जीवन यापन किया अपितु जीवन दर्शन भी दिया। गांधी का व्यवहार ही उनका दर्शन है। गांधी जी ने जो कुछ भी कहा उसे जीवन में उतारने के बाद ही कहा, अर्थात गांधी के व्यक्तित्व और कृतित्व में उनकी वाणी, विचार और व्यवहार तीनों का सामंजस्य मिलता है और इसी कारण गांधी कभी सत्याग्रही हैं, कहीं अहिंसाग्रही हैं और कहीं कर्माग्रही हैं, कर्म के आग्रह करते हैं। हमेशा ही गांधी जीवन पथ पर हार्ट, हैंड और ब्रेन तीनों के कॉम्बिनेशन की बात करते थे और इसीलिए चाहे शिक्षा का क्षेत्र हो, न्याय का क्षेत्र हो, राज्य का क्षेत्र हो, प्रशासन का क्षेत्र हो, गांधी के व्यक्तित्व का संतुलक स्वरूप सभी को प्रेरित करता रहा। गांधी जी को कहा जाता है कि वह एपोस्टल ऑफ पीस हैं, शांति के धर्मदूत, देवदूत, पैगंबर। ऐसा इसलिए कि गांधी ने सत्य और अहिंसा के माध्यम से मानवता के निरंतर अभियोजन और कल्याण की बात की है। उनके जीवन का एक पक्ष मैत्री भाव भी है। सर्वप्रथम गांधी और CF एंड्रूज की मुलाकात, संवाद और साहचर्य ही इस मैत्री भाव का आधार बनी। गांधी जी का कहना था कि सत्य के साथ हम केवल प्रयोग ही ना करें, सत्य का निरंतर अनुसरण करें, क्योंकि भारतीय व्यवस्था में सत्य ही ईश्वर है और ऐसा इसलिए है कि सत्य वही है जिसकी सत्ता होती है और सबसे बड़ा मित्र हमारे विधान में ईश्वर को ही कहा गया है। पितु, मातु, सहायक, स्वामी, सखा, इतने स्वरूप हैं ईश्वर के। तुम्हें माता चित्ता, तुम्हें बंधु त्वमेव। यह भाव निरंतर गांधी जी ने अपने अंतर मन में रखा और इसीलिए जब CF एंड्रूज से उनका संवाद हुआ, उनकी मैत्री हुई, तो हमेशा गांधी जी कहते थे मित्रता के लिए धर्म, जाति, क्षेत्र, वर्ग, वर्ण, विचार मायने नहीं रखते। मित्रता के लिए केवल मन का भाव रखता है। अगर हमारा मन मिलता है, हमारे अंदर कल्याण की वृत्ति है, तो सहज मित्रता हो जाएगी। मित्रता बिना शर्त होती है और बिना शर्त होती है, इसलिए यह प्रेम, करुणा से हमेशा आवृत होती है और यह सत्य से ही संचालित होती है, क्योंकि यही एक ऐसा संबंध है जिसमें आयु, अवस्था, पद, देश, समाज यह पीछे चले जाते हैं, गौण हो जाते हैं, छूट नहीं जाते। इस मैत्री भाव में संकलित रूप से समाहित हो जाते हैं, कारण कि इसमें कोई स्वार्थ नहीं होता। इसलिए हमेशा गांधी जी कहा करते थे कि हमारा जो मिलन है ईश्वर के साथ, समाज के साथ, परिवार के साथ, व्यस्त के साथ, समस्त के साथ, श्रेष्ठ के साथ, वह निस्वार्थ होना चाहिए। यह मित्रता का प्रथम, एकमात्र और अंतिम अवलंब है जहां स्वार्थ आ जाता है वहां से प्रेम पृथक होता है, वहां से करुणा पृथक हो जाती है, दया की भावना पृथक हो जाती है और सत्य हमारा साथ छोड़ देता है। ईश्वर में स्वार्थ नहीं होता और इसीलिए ईश्वर सर्वोपरि है और उसी के विधान से हम संचालित होते हैं। सत्य के बहुत अर्थ, मित्रता के बहुत सारे सोपान गांधी जी ने स्थान स्थान पर, क्षेत्र क्षेत्र में विचारित भी किया, व्याख्यायित भी किया और उसके संदर्भ को लेकर निरंतर चलते रहे। इसी कारण वह पॉलिटिशियन अमंग द सेंट्स कहे गए और सेंट अमंग द पॉलिटिशियंस कहे गए। उनका मूल भाव था सत्य से संचालित व्यवस्था का आग्रह, और अगर व्यवस्था सत्य से संचालित है तो निश्चित रूप से राजनीति और धर्म में कोई भेद नहीं होगा। गांधी जी कभी भेद नहीं मानते थे राजनीति और धर्म में, और हमेशा कहते थे कि अगर राजनीति और धर्म आपस में मिले हुए हैं तो राजनीति की दिशा बहुधा सर्वदा सकारात्मक ही होगी, कल्याण परक ही होगी। इसीलिए गांधी युवा काल से लेकर और उत्तरार्ध तक सतत सक्रिय रहे और अपने विचारों को व्यवहार में लाकर पूरी मानवता को संदेश देते रहे। गांधी का यह सिद्धांत जो सत्य, प्रेम और करुणा का सिद्धांत है, पूरी मानवता का क्रमशः अवलंब बनता चला गया और आज दुनिया में इसी की विशेष आवश्यकता है। यह केवल मनुष्य मनुष्य के बीच का संबंध नहीं है, जड़ और चेतन के बीच का संबंध है, मनुष्य और प्रकृति के बीच का संबंध है, पुरुष और प्रकृति के संबंध के बीच का संबंध है और पूरी मानवता को जोड़ने वाला तंतु है, सूत्र है और अवलंब है। इसलिए अगर गांधी के सत्य, अहिंसा और मैत्री भाव को लेकर के चला जाए तो न तो समाज में कहीं टकराव परिलक्षित होगा, न व्यक्ति के व्यक्तित्व में कहीं अंतर विरोध परिलक्षित होगा और न ही दुनिया के विभिन्न देशों में टकराव की स्थिति बनेगी। अतः संवेदना, सहयोग, सद्भाव, सामंजस्य और साहचर्य के लिए गांधी का सिद्धांत हमेशा से प्रासंगिक रहा है, आने वाले दिनों में भी प्रासंगिक रहेगा। मुझे पूरा विश्वास है कि आज के व्याख्यान के जो दो संदर्भ हैं, मैत्री का संदर्भ और सत्य का संदर्भ, ट्रूथ एंड इंटीग्रिटी, वस्तुतः हम सत्य से ही अपने जीवन के सारे अवयवों को जोड़ते हैं और इसी में अखंडता का भाव निहित होता है। हम वैयक्तिक जीवन में शाश्वत मूल्यों से संपृक्त होकर अविच्छेद्य कल्याण में विचार को व्यवहारित करें अथवा राष्ट्र की अखंडता की बात करें, समाज के संगुम्फन की बात करें अथवा अंतरराष्ट्रीय फलक पर राष्ट्रों के पारस्परिक मेल मिलाप की बात करें, सद्भावना की बात करें, तो सर्वत्र गांधी के सिद्धांत ही दिखलाई देते हैं। गांधी के सिद्धांत दिखते हैं, विचार दिखते हैं, गांधी वाद विवाद से ऊपर है। इसलिए गांधीवाद जैसा कोई शब्द नहीं है जैसा गांधी जी कहा करते थे। वाद ट्रुथ के बहुत नीचे आता है, इस सभी के ऊपर बैठता है सत्य, और सत्य के आग्रही होने के कारण ही गांधी सत्य नारायण का दर्शन कर सके। ज्ञात मानव इतिहास में बहुत कम ऐसे लोग हैं जिन्होंने अंतिम समय भगवान राम के स्मरण के साथ जीवन यात्रा पूर्ण की हो, और यही गांधी के सत्याश्रय होने का सबसे बड़ा प्रमाण है। अगर हम सत्य का आश्रय करें और मैत्री भाव लेकर के चलें तो सर्वत्र हमारे अंदर मजबूती रहेगी, हमारे द्वारा कहीं विचलन का भाव नहीं आएगा। हमारा वैयक्तिक उन्नयन तो होगा ही, सामाजिक उन्नति होगी, राष्ट्र की उन्नति होगी और पूरी मानवता के लिए हम एक सुंदर परिवेश सृजित कर सकेंगे। आइए हम गांधी के सिद्धांतों का अवलंबन करें, अनुशीलन करें और उस पर चलने का प्रयास करें। सत्य का आग्रही होना ये एक बात है, लेकिन सत्य पर चलना यह बहुत कठिन होता है। गांधी जी जैसे लोग ही आजीवन सत्य के साथ प्रयोग कर सकते हैं। हम वैयक्तिक जीवन में संकल्प लें कि एक दिन कम से कम ऐसा होना चाहिए जिस दिन हम 100% सत्य का आग्रह करें, 100% सत्य का संवाद करें। मेरा ये कहना नहीं है कि आप सत्य से इतर होते हैं, सत्य का आग्रह करना, अर्थात अपने अंतर मन के हिसाब से, अंतर विवेक के हिसाब से, अंतःकरण की आवाज के हिसाब से आचरण करना। इसलिए जो कॉन्शियंस है ये बहुत ज्यादा मायने रखता है। गांधी जी को कहा जाता था he is the voice of conscience, वह अंतःकरण की आवाज है। आइए हम सभी अपने अंतःकरण की आवाज को सुने और आज की यांत्रिक, भौतिक और कृत्रिम व्यवस्था के ऊपर अपनी नैसर्गिक मान्यताओं को स्थान प्रदान करें। हम मनुष्य से महात्मा की यात्रा करें, हम व्यष्टि से समष्टि तक की यात्रा करें और हम पूर्णता को प्राप्त करें। गांधी जी औपनिषदिक दर्शन में भी बहुत विश्वास करते थे। आज के दिन हम सत्य को उस रूप में देखें कि सत्य न तो आंशिक होता है, न अर्ध होता है, यह केवल पूर्ण ही होता है। और पूर्ण की सत्ता सर्वत्र होती है, भले ही उसमें से हम कुछ निकालने की कोशिश करें। ओम पूर्णमिदः पूर्णमिदं पूर्णात् पूर्णमुदच्यते पूर्णस्य पूर्णमादाय पूर्णमेवावशिष्यते। मैं विश्वविद्यालय की ओर से प्रोफेसर अजय सकारिया जी का और प्रोफेसर निको स्लेट जी का बहुत बहुत स्वागत करता हूँ, अभिनंदन करता हूँ। और जो लोग भी आज इस कार्यक्रम से जुड़े हैं, गांधी के सिद्धांतों का पारायण करें, क्योंकि गांधी सतत प्रेरणा के स्रोत हैं, वह शांति दूत हैं, वह शांति, सहयोग और चरय वेद का संदेश देने वाले देवदूत हैं। हम उनका नमन करें। आप सभी को बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद सर। आपका व्याख्यान हमेशा ही ज्ञानवर्धक एवं पथ प्रेरक होता है। एक बार फिर से हम आपको धन्यवाद देते हैं। After this excellent introductory remark by our Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, may I now invite Professor Ajay Sakaria for his talk on Gandhi and the question of friendship. Before that, I request all the participants to kindly post your questions in the chat box, and after the talk of Professor Sakaria, we shall put those questions and he shall be happy to reply to them. Sir, you are requested to begin. Sir, kindly unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this invitation, and thank you very much for this very generous and very nice introduction. You know, I'm always a little diffident when I come to events like this, because one of the dangers of an event like this is that we all come, and something I say always whenever I'm at an event like this, that we come, we pay homage to Gandhi, and we go away with no change in our relationship to the world. You know, because Gandhi has become like king here in the US, somebody whom everyone invokes, including those whose politics and everyday lives are opposed to everything that Gandhi stands for, right? So whenever I'm asked to attend a Gandhi event, I worry, especially when it's a public-facing event, that, and rather than only for other Gandhi scholars, that I might participate in this process of taming Gandhi, making him into a sweet old toothless man whom everybody loves to love. So I shall try my best to avoid doing that. And what I want to, in some senses, what I always try and do when I speak about Gandhi and all the figures I work on, is what I find interesting about thinkers is thinking with them. That is to say, taking their thoughts, staying with their thoughts, but being faithful to them in a way that might also bring them into conversation with our present moment. And that's the spirit in which I'll be speaking about this. And this essay itself is part of a longer project, which I'm writing an essay on friendship. One of the two books I'm working on, one is called What is Democratic Secularism? That's the one I mentioned that's the one you mentioned. The other one is on friendship. It doesn't yet have a name, right? So let me, without further ado, jump into the paper itself. So in his autobiography, Gandhi writes about how in his early teens, one of his intimate friends persuaded him to eat meat. The friend argued that Indians were a weak people because they were vegetarian, and that Gandhi should eat meat to become strong. Gandhi's first experience is traumatizing. He had a bad nightmare where it would seem, and I'm quoting him, where it would seem as though a live goat were bleating inside me. But he tries meat again and begins to like it, and even becomes, as he puts it, a relisher of meat dishes. This continues for around a year, and he gives up eventually only because he's torn by remorse at having to hide his meat eating from his parents. Now, I'm sure all of you know this episode, right? Because I mean, one of the books that we all read growing up is Gandhi's autobiography, right? So none of you will be surprised by this story. But the reason I mention this story is that it becomes an occasion for Gandhi to reflect on friendship. He writes that he had formed the friendship in the spirit of a reformer, Sudharak, right? But he now saw that his calculation was wrong. And he goes on, I'm quoting now from his autobiography. It is good to reform, but even so, one should not venture into deep waters. There can be no friendship with one who is to be reformed. Friendship involves a sensibility of identity of souls. That's what he says. The word is used in Gujarati is Advait Bhav. In such a friendship, the scope for reform is very limited. My feeling is that intimate friendships are undesirable because man quickly takes in vice. To take in virtue, considerable effort is necessary. Those who wish to be friends with the Atma, with God, must remain alone or make friends with the whole world. I repeat, must remain alone or make friends with the whole world. Whether the above thoughts are appropriate or inappropriate, my efforts to cultivate an intimate friendship proved a failure. Unquote. Now, on first glance, there's something a little odd about this fiat against intimate friendships. Gandhi himself was quite unable to act on it in his own life. As the Vice Chancellor was also pointing out, he might have failed in this instance to cultivate an intimate friendship, but he quite assiduously and arguably successfully cultivated several other intimate friendships, with C.F. Andrews, with Herman Kallenbach, with Mahadev Desai, with Sarla Devi Chaudrani, and this is just to mention a few, right? If you look at the amount of time he spends writing letters to each of these people, it's astonishing. Still, there may be a difference in these friendships and those with the unnamed friend. An intimate friendship turns friends inwards, and that's the kind he had with the unnamed friend. But these later friendships turn friends outwards. Specifically, all of these are friends who together address matters of social justice. And that orientation shapes also their relationship with each other. Gandhi and his friends were constantly engaged in trying to reform one another, reform here in the sense of a transformation of the self, rather than merely changing the interlocutor's understanding on matters that can be held apart from their personhood. Right? So reform here in the sense of, changing one's relationship with the friend, changing the friend's relationship with the world, changing one's own relationship with the world. Consider his friendship with Kallenbach, which is, as you know, very, very famous. And in the autobiography itself, he recounts the story of how during a ship journey in 1914, he threw away a pair of Kallenbach's quote-unquote costly binoculars. And I shall quote now. I tried to impress on him that this possession was not in keeping with the ideal of simplicity that we aspired to reach. Our discussions came to a head one day as we were standing near the porthole of our cabin. Rather than allow these to be a bone of contention between us, why not throw them into the sea and be done with them, said I. Certainly throw the wretched things away, said Mr. Kallenbach. I mean it, said I. So do I, quickly came the reply. And forthwith I flung them into the sea. They were worth some 7 pounds, but their value lay less in their price than Mr. Kallenbach's infatuation for them. However, having got rid of them, he never regretted it. I will confess that I at least feel a sympathetic wince for poor Kallenbach. Setting that wince aside for now, what I wish to stress is that this intimate friendship is also a political relationship, organized around an ideal of simplicity that challenges dominant norms. This politicalness leavens their intimacy with another dimension, makes it into another concept of friendship. This concept can be discerned also in his description of the political practice for which he is best known, satyagraha, a word which, as I'm sure all of you know, he translates in many, many ways. Sometimes he calls it love force, sometimes he calls it truth force, sometimes he calls it soul force, civil resistance, passive resistance, and also, this is what I want to stress, the law of friendship. So, there's this very famous occasion where there's this conflict between Hindus and Muslims, and people are talking of the need for justice. And he says this talk therefore of justice and nothing but justice is a thoughtless, angry, and ignorant outburst, whether it comes from Hindus or Muslims. So long as Hindus and Muslims continue to prate about justice, they will never come together. Might is right is the last word of justice and nothing but justice. After we have sufficiently broken one another's heads, we shall recognize that vengeance was not the law of friendship, nor justice, but surrender, and nothing but surrender was the law of friendship. Right? The word that is translated as surrender here is tyaga. So, proposed here is something very paradoxical, almost unthinkable in our conventional vocabulary. And this is the proposal of political friendship, or a remaking of friendship into neighborliness. Right? Now, there is a word that Gandhi uses for neighborliness. So we don't usually don't think of translating it as neighborliness. And this is the word Swadeshi. Of course, normally when we think of Swadeshi, we think of the act of buying and consuming goods made in one's own country or land. But Gandhi points to the spirit organizing Swadeshi, and he offers the following definition of it. Swadeshi is that spirit in us which restricts us to the use of and service of our immediate surroundings to the exclusion of the more remote. Or, as he elaborates on another occasion, one rule of Swadeshi is that in serving people, we should first serve those who live near us. There is also an opposite rule that we should first serve those who are distant from us and then those who are near us. Near in the first rule means physically near, distant in the second rule means distant from us mentally. The reason behind this rule of Swadeshi is that we cannot reach all human beings in the world. If instead of serving the person near you, you ignore your neighbor and seek to serve someone living far away, that would be pride on your part. So that is his definition of Swadeshi. And as you can see, once he's defined Swadeshi, the idea of neighborliness is very, very central to how he thinks Swadeshi. Right? So, I would like to pursue this insight and ask, who are our neighbors? If we ask this question conceptually, then it might be said that the criterion of the neighbor is a distinctive kind of proximity, that of vulnerability. Put differently, our neighbors are those to whom we are vulnerable, whether in a physical sense, in the sense that they can hurt us, or in an affective sense, again, in the sense that we care about them, and precisely because of that, they can hurt us non-physically also, right? So it's not those who are only vulnerable to us without us being vulnerable to them. With them, we exercise a relationship of mastery without neighborliness. So if we master somebody, then we are not necessarily their neighbors, right? It's only when we experience a certain kind of vulnerability to them that there's a relationship of neighborliness, right? Now, neighbors could be friends, enemies, or even those whose existence we are not aware of. Perhaps part of the terror that Americans experienced on and after 9/11 was precisely the discovery of new neighbors, and neighbors that they did not particularly want. And the experience of climate change is partially the discovery that the climate and the weather, which we had thought we had mastered, now surges into our life in unanticipated ways, making us vulnerable in ways that we had not anticipated. So even non-sentient elements, such as the weather, can become our neighbors. Indeed, it is likely only in the modern world that we have forgotten this for so long, as Amitav Ghosh reminds us in his excellent book, The Great Derangement, that we have forgotten it for so long and with such disastrous consequences. So being a neighbor is also, as you might infer, not necessarily about physical proximity. For example, the very fact that this seminar is being conducted online through Google Meet puts us in a relation of non-physical proximity to each other. We are vulnerable to each other, right? In the sense that you are being addressed by me, maybe in some affective way, it will matter to you. And I, in turn, will be addressed by you at the end of this process, right? So neighborliness or political friendship also, I would say. But okay, so that's the figure of the neighbor. Having talked to the figure of the neighbor, I would now like to shift to the idea of neighborliness, which is not the same as the figure of the neighbor. It is a kind of reworking of the figure of the neighbor. So neighborliness or political friendship involves reworking this world of neighbors in three ways. One, it privileges neighbors in closer proximity over neighbors who are further away. This is not about antagonism to neighbors further away, as Gandhi specifies on several occasions. Also, there can be no hard and fast rule about physical proximity. As with all else, it requires discernment to know one's neighbors, know who are one's neighbors. Right? Two, it seeks to convert neighbors in physical proximity into friends. Right? That's why I use the phrase political friendship. Political friendship. As the passage above reminds us, many of those physically near us, not just sapient beings, but also the sentient and non-sentient world, are very distant from us mentally or far from our thoughts and concerns, or perhaps even worse, in our thoughts and concerns as only enemies, right? So neighborliness would in some senses try and substitute these relationships with relations of friendship. Yeah. Three, neighborliness is not simply the experience of finding neighbors. It is more. It is a cultivation of vulnerability as a disposition towards those near us. And moreover, a making of vulnerability into the very modality of social and political organizing. This is one way of thinking of Satyagraha, as I've argued elsewhere, is that it is a practice of vulnerability. The making of vulnerability itself into a political practice, right? So that you can't just be vulnerable at random. There is a system to the way he thinks of it. Four, like friendship itself, neighborliness is a relationship of finitude. In other words, it is not that one is more or less happy in relations of neighborliness. That would anyway be a utilitarian criterion by which to evaluate this activity of neighborliness. It is rather that to be a neighbor is to make oneself and one's neighbors into finite entities. This is why some things, say for example drones or more broadly weaponry that attacks from afar, can never be made neighbors. So, Swadeshi is his name for this task of political friendship as a relationship of neighborliness. Okay. So this is a broad framing of what I want to do. Since I'm, we have limited time and I want to try and get through some more of the stuff. I want to just, pick up one axis along which I could have developed this argument, right? And this is the axis of what does it mean to think of fearlessness in friendship, right? Fear, the words that Gandhi uses a lot are abhay and shaurya, fearlessness and courage. And Gandhi is very clear that without courage, there can be no Satyagraha, there can be no Swadeshi. Right? And this is not just any courage, it is a very particular kind of courage. Right? In 1910, around the time that he writes in Swaraj, he also writes to his nephew, Narandas Gandhi, and he asks, do you know the fundamental principles of our religion? You will perhaps say that you're able to recite the whole of the Gita, and that you know its meaning, and you wonder why I'm asking you about fundamental principles. Knowing the fundamentals, as I interpret it, means putting them in practice. Right? The first attribute of the divine heritage, Daivi Sampada as he puts it, is fearlessness. I hope you remember that verse. Have you attained the state of fearlessness to any extent? You will notice in this passage something that will strike many of us as unusual, the association of religion and fearlessness. In my book, Unconditional Equality, I have explored some aspects of this connection between religion and fearlessness, or religious fearlessness, right? And obviously this religious fearlessness is not to be confused with religious bigotry, right? I'll be coming to that actually in a minute. But he's in some senses talking of a particular kind of fearlessness. And I want to try and throw that fearlessness into sharper relief by contrasting it to three other forms of fearlessness. These I will call the fearlessness of rage, the courage of the warrior, and moral courage. So it seems to me that together these four forms of fearlessness, which I would are especially relevant for thinking about democratic politics today. And I say this because the exercise of modern democratic citizenship is inseparable from a courage that is minimally moral and maximally religious in Gandhi's sense. In times of danger, it partakes also of at least the warrior's courage. Moreover, to understand courage in our times is also to understand its opposite, which is not just cowardice, but evil. And now Gandhi is very clear that cowardice for him is the biggest weakness of the Indian people, and it must be overcome before anything else is possible. The most dramatic example of this is his campaign during the First World War to have Indian peasants join the British Army. His argument went something like this. If you think of somebody who's calling for non-violence, also asking peasants to join the Indian Army, you may think of it as contradictory. But his argument was something like this: that look, Satyagraha involves a courage greater than that involved in picking up arms. If you have the courage for Satyagraha, for Ahimsa, for confronting the British non-violently, then it is fine to not join the army. But most of the time you're not joining the army, not because you have a strong moral objection to it, but because you don't have the fearlessness necessary to even take up arms, let alone practice Ahimsa. So it is better to pick up arms and develop at least the fearlessness of the warrior rather than be entirely cowardly. Okay, so you can see that one of the key things that he's talking about is that basically cowardice should not be there, right? So that's very central. And with that, I will have to just get into talking about these four forms of fearlessness that he talks of. Perhaps the best way to approach the first category that I'm talking of, rage, is through attention to Savarkar and more broadly to Hindutva. As the influence of Savarkar in Indian public life has risen, so too has the insistence on his honorific, Veer, heroic, brave, courageous, warrior-like. When a plaque was put up in Andaman Cellular Jail, it was to Veer Savarkar. When roads are renamed, they're usually to Veer Savarkar, rarely to V.D. Savarkar. Savarkar has become inseparable from his honorific. We do not know much about how this honorific originates. Right? From what we do know, it seems very, very likely that Savarkar himself played a role in popularizing it. Soon after his release from prison, a book is published called Life of the Barrister Savarkar. The author of the book is identified only as Chitragupta, and it is only many years later that Savarkar is revealed to be its author. That book flows with enormous, rapturous admiration for Savarkar, for his valor, for his bravery, etc. Okay. Now, what emerges very clearly from the book is that it is since if you consider that this book is written by Savarkar himself, is not simply that Savarkar is promoting himself, but also the fact that Savarkar is very important for Savarkar to think of himself as brave and to project himself to the world as brave. And it is not only Savarkar and his admirers who are taken up by the honorific. As we know, it is commonplace now for newspapers and other media sources to use it. Now, what makes this honorific so intriguing is that it does not fit Savarkar very well. In the case of, say, Bhagat Singh, who's another figure whom, as you know, is often described as Veer, all that we know about him suggests that the honorific is appropriate. But matters are murkier in the case of Savarkar. To begin with, there is something a bit off about how this book that Savarkar authors itself harps on Savarkar's valor. Normally, the brave do not go about shouting to the world about their bravery. It is almost always the case that those whom the world calls courageous even do not necessarily think of themselves as courageous. They generally say they were able to do what they did because they saw it had to be done. And sometimes it goes much further still. Gandhi is talking all the time of courage, but he, in fact, he keeps saying that, look, I'm not fearless. I don't think I'm fearless enough. I don't think I'll be courageous enough when push comes to shove, right? So he keeps saying, I'm trying to cultivate courage. He does not say that I am courageous, right? So there is a love of courage here in Gandhi's case, but he loves courage as something that he's striving for. Okay. Now, in the case of Savarkar, matters get murkier still when we consider his actions. Certainly, his actions before his arrest display a remarkable fearlessness. But during his incarceration in Andaman jail, he wrote 3 obsequious petitions to the British, in which he promised complete cooperation with the British if he would be released. My point is not to denigrate him for writing these petitions. The brutal tortures that the British inflicted on prisoners in the Andaman jails are legendary. And most of us would have collapsed if we had to endure a fraction of anything similar. It could also be argued, as many of his defenders have, that he signed his petitions for strategic reasons. My point is only to stress that this collapse, that's how it collapsed, and there were quite a few prisoners who did not collapse, does at the very least make the ascription of courage to him contentious. Right? Again, after his release from Ratnagiri prison, while he encouraged his followers, for example, Godse, to acts of violence, he also made sure that he would not be implicated in these acts. Of course, his admirers have once again suggested that by keeping himself safe and sacrificing other associates, he was only acting as a good general, conserving himself for a larger cause. Right? And again, all I'm trying to say is, yeah, that may be the case, but at least this throws question on, is the word veer the most appropriate one? An even more troubling example could be from Six Epochs, his book, where he claims that Muslim invaders raped Hindu women and castigates Hindu rulers, including Shivaji, for not having resorted to retaliatory rape. It is difficult by any criteria, and certainly by the modern criteria that we appropriate for a modern figure, to describe as heroic or courageous someone who calls for the use of rape as a political weapon. Now, the reason I'm pointing all this out is not to deny the rightness, not so much to say that the honorific should not be applied, but to say that when an honorific fits so badly, then the question arises, why is Savarkar so drawn to it, and why are people so drawn to it today? Right? So it's a symptom. I'm interested in it more as a symptom rather than to say whether it's right or wrong. Say, why not describe Savarkar with terms that would fit him better? Say, as a savvy or strategic operator, as one easily could. Right? Why does the honorific matter so much to his followers and him? And why have we as a society been willing to concur in continuing with that honorific? What is the work that this honorific does? And I pick on this because I think it's a perfect example of what I mean by the fearlessness of rage. And what I schematically want to suggest is that the honorific matters so much to Savarkar and his followers because it does the work of repressing the anxiety, even the recognition that Hindutva exemplifies not courage, but rage, right? And I'm using these terms here not to describe individual psychologies, but to indicate orientations that are social and political. Of course, these orientations are always borne by individuals, right? But these are basically, I'm talking of social and political orientations, not of individual psychologies. Yeah. And courage and rage, I think, is a very important contrast to me, right? Though courage and rage sound like they're homonyms, almost complementary. Right? He would, when he talks of giving up on Republican democracy, he talks of relinquishing it. That is to say that one does not reject it, one gives up on it to the extent that one develops the ability to do so. Okay, so I will stop here. And I just, at a time when we have weaponized cowardice, when we have mistaken cowardice as courage, when we shrilly shout down anyone who says otherwise, I thought that the best way to remember Gandhi would be to remember what courage means for Gandhi. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. Yeah, thank you. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, sir, for that brilliant lecture and very thoughtful deliberation. We'll take a few questions with your permission, sir.
Of course.
Yeah.
I will just try and find the questions. They'll all be in the chat, right?
Yeah, but I would rather speak them out for you.
Okay, that'll be easier for me also, because
Yeah,
if I try
exactly.
to them, it'll be very difficult.
The first question would be that can we take increasing incidences of global protests as a proxy for our societies becoming more fearlessness?
I do think that that there are moments when fearlessness comes more to the front. Yes, certainly. I would say that to the extent that democratic equality is becoming more and more difficult to deny, there are more protests. But unfortunately, it is also a time when we see an enormous increase in the power of the state, right? And if you think, for example, of both China or India, or what's happening to the Uyghurs in China, or what's happening in Hong Kong, the state is also getting far more powerful. So yes, enormous fearlessness is there, but also there is an upsurge in the repressive power of the state, right?
Okay. Next is, so there are two questions asked by this participant. First one is the concept of Swaraj as explained is at odds with the idea of cosmopolitanism? And the second one is that joining war being seen as courage appears contradictory to the ideal of non-violence, which is perhaps more central to the Gandhian ideology. So would you say the appeal to join war may be seen as tactical move in context of independence movement that than as an idea creating incoherence?
No. I would put it this way, and I think it's a very important question. The first question is about the relationship between cosmopolitanism and Swaraj. And there's a very famous quote from Gandhi where he says that look, I'm willing to accept everything from the world, but I don't want to be swept off my feet. And when he says Swaraj, he says that, look, because I'm a limited being, I focus on those around me first. This does not mean that I reject the rest, right? It means that I focus on that which is closest to me, including those in my physical proximity who I'm hostile to, right? So the interesting thing about neighbors, which I should have said, but I forgot to, is that one does not choose one's neighbors, right? One just gets one's neighbors, right? And that's a very, very important aspect of neighborliness. Okay.
Yeah.
The second question you're asking is about war. And I think it's very important to recognize that Gandhi is not asking for this tactically. He's saying this because of his understanding of courage, right? He's saying that, look, the fearlessness, rage, he does not even consider courage. He considers it merely intoxication, right? Merely a form of cowardice, a weaponized cowardice, right? But the warrior, the soldier, he considers has at least the courage of trying to fight an enemy, right? So he tells people that, look, you should be nonviolent, but nonviolence requires courage. Maybe you don't have the courage for that. Then at least try to develop the courage to go to fight, to bear arms, right? So it's a kind of lesser form of courage. So I might even say that courage is in some senses a governing value that produces